in lieu of our chairman, my name is Michael Osmond, in case you haven't met me. I teach history and theory classes in the Department of Architecture. And I'm so pleased to have the opportunity to introduce our speaker, Sean Griffiths, to you all tonight. Sean is the director and co-founder of FAT, Fashion Architecture Taste, an architecture studio based in London. And I find it fascinating that this studio has been lavished with the type of praise that they must find simply silly. True originals, says the Financial Times, or as Icon magazine has pronounced, FAT's buildings are utterly unique. So if both are quotations that I found on their website, one might ask why I think that Sean and company would find these comments silly. Well, as many of you are probably aware, FAT was invited to curate an exhibition at the Arsenale in last summer's Biennale, and they chose as their theme a museum of copying. And the work that they produced for this exhibition, as well as the work that they solicited from others, flirts with the possibility of being not conventionally original. So if an artist alone in his studio with his thoughts in his hands represents an authentic original, then the projects in the Arsenale were studies in how to gain interest by the opposite of the original, by the process of repetition. In other words, to say that the buildings designed by FAT are unique, or that the studio is truly original, only exemplifies the persistence of a myth that FAT's directors have been trying hard to challenge. That myth being that that of the originality of the avant-garde architect. And in the book, if you should like to call it that, that describes their project, ROTUNDA, REDUX, which I think will be seen shortly. In that book, they write that the manufacture of a copy is a project in and of itself, separate from its source. Its drive for fidelity often requires entirely new armatures and technologies to be invented. Palladio's architecture, therefore, the architecture of much of the Renaissance, centered on the problem of copying. So I leave it to Sean to describe the project, but simply put, if you're looking for the innovation, it's in the modes of repetition that they employ to produce the project. It is an original type of copy. I would like to conclude by my introduction by a question to Sean that I hope he might be able to answer. Is there a style of the copy? And what I mean by style is a collective and unconscious desire for the certain aesthetic dispositions, like common aesthetic dispositions. In other words, to be more specific, a style of the copy would have to be a kind of collective desire for a look of repetition. And if there is such a style, then might we still have the possibility of originality, of an authentic ego that consciously seeks out new ways of copying? So the question is, what is the style of copy? And is it somehow involved in the specter of postmodernism, radical or not? Or is it actually something completely new?
Can you hear me first? Is the question that I have back to you?
Yeah.
That sounds okay.
Sounds great.
Okay, good, thank you. Thank you, Michael, for the introduction. The only problem with it is I now feel no need to give the lecture because it was so much more eloquent than anything I'm going to say. It's particularly great to be here in Los Angeles talking about our work, which has been unfolding to some people's delight and admittedly to some people's horror for nearly 20 years now. And I think one of the reasons I'm very pleased that we're doing it here today is that something about Los Angeles culture has had, I think, a very profound effect on what we do. There's something about the contradictions of LA. It's extreme kind of, how do you call it, sort of superficial versus great intellectual depth at the same time. It somehow manages to have, it's kind of a world of, Tinseltown, but Schoenberg was here, and Adorno, and Thomas Mann was here. You know, it's kind of these kind of contradictions I think are fascinating. Of course, Los Angeles is the city of the suburb. We showed a lot of interest in suburbs, which has not pleased a lot of our friends in the profession. The idea of theatricality, the contradiction between sunshine and noir, as perhaps beautifully explained in Mike Davis's book, City of Chords, which I read when I was a student. These kind of contradictions, the superficial and the deep, the dark and the sunny, the urban and the suburb, and of course the fake and the authentic. I think all of these things have informed what we have done over the last 20 years very, very deeply. And of course one of the issues when we talk about fakes, a main form of fake is the thing called the copy. So we're going to talk a little bit about some copies. Copying is a marvellous mode of architectural innovation. It's particularly useful when you haven't got any ideas, because you can just steal somebody else's. And of course, I can't remember who said it, but there's that famous, the worst artists borrow, the best artists steal. And I think this is an example of that. This is a work by Mario Botta, who's not particularly a famous architect, but I think this is utterly brilliant. This is a copy of one of my favourite buildings in the world, which is the Church of San Carlo alla Quattro Fontane in Rome by Francesco Borromini. Except he only did half of it, which kind of improved it. It's the only possible way you could have improved that building. You know, it's one of those buildings you can't add to. You can take away from and make it better. But I think this is such a great thing. And of course, it's just the interior, which looks like it's carved out of a big block of charred wood. And by far and away, the best work Mario Botta has ever done. But the world of copying as well, you know, but we're not the first to talk about it. For us, it opens up a whole series of fields of inquiry, which I think architects' obsession and their fetishization of the idea of originality closes down. You know, I'm horrified when Frank Gehry, whose early works I hugely admire. I can't stand all the bendy silver stuff that he does on Edmund Rice, but you know, when he talks about Borromini, I just think, oh, for God's sake, Frank, shut up, please. And these fields of inquiry include, of course, the theories of people like Walter Benjamin, talking about the work of art in the age of mechanical reproduction, which of course was an idea that was at the heart of an artist like Andy Warhol. In other instances, you can look at copying from the point of view of a sort of geometrical reproduction, where self-similar forms repeat themselves, and we get fractal geometry developing out of that kind of thing, these kind of simple shapes that turn into very complex forms in a sort of very rigorous way, in the example of the cock snowflake, which I'm afraid to inform you won't be the first cock you'll be seeing. There's the whole sort of Duchampian objet trouvé, and it's extension into ideas of collage, of taking found objects. This is a piece of work which is allegedly the first work of pop art, produced by a British artist, Richard Hamilton. Just what is it that makes today's home so different, so appealing? Made in 1956. And it is an amazingly prescient architectural space made up entirely of found objects from magazines and exploring, you might call the sexuality of consumer culture, a kind of fetishization again. And I've always loved the lady on the right with the, what appears to be a lampshade on her head. What she's doing next to that tin of ham. And the view out of the window to the poster for the jazz singer, Al Jolson. I mean, this is just the most incredible architectural space, which of course is not made in an architectural way. And this is an idea I like. There's an architectural writer called Kimberly Doby, I think is possibly based in these parts, an American academic. And she wrote an essay on the idea of authenticity many years ago, out of which came this diagram, which I've always loved, which shows in picture A, there is some shutters shut across a window. In B, the same shutters are open. In C, we are told the shutters are now fixed back to the wall and are no longer functional, have become mere decoration. And in D, the shutters have reduced in size such that they are no longer the same size of the windows that they're ostensibly meant to cover, and hence have become pure sign, pure representation of the idea of shutter. And of Dovey in this particular essay, I think she's changed her position on this, stuff I've read from her more recently, is appalled at this degradation from the authentic object to the fake in D, whereas of course I'm enthralled by the degradation from A to D. So we come to the Museum of Copying. I'm not going to show this in a huge amount of detail because I could probably talk about this all night, and I'd like to show you some other things too, but very quickly, the idea of copying is certainly not new to architecture. It's gone on throughout the history of architecture. Most architects today do it, they're in denial about it. They call it influence or precedent or something. You look at them and say, why does your building look exactly like Zaha Hadid's buildings? Because, so, but there was a time when, in the time of Palladio, for example, in the late Renaissance, when the work of art and indeed of architecture was valued by its how close it was, its fidelity to the original that it was copying. And this is the kind of Greek idea of mimesis or mimesis, you might call it in these parts, which is that art is somehow a copy of nature. And this, of course, has gone out the window now. Now value is given by its relationship to something called originality, which is very, very rarely original. But the beautiful thing about the Villa Rotunda, Palladio's very famous building in Vicenza, in the Veneto area of Italy, is that it's a copy in so many wonderful ways. Firstly, of course, it's the Roman villa with the Greek temple attached. But it's also brilliantly copying itself geometrically on almost any axis, whether it be 45 degrees or 90 degrees or 180 degrees. If you took a slice through that building, you would recognize it as a repeat of itself, a rotational repeat of itself. so there's something beautifully intrinsic about the kind of the geometry of this thing that has a kind of life of its own. But now we see it as the sort of temple and the villa. Of course, it copies itself on its facades as well. Each of the 4 facades is identical. And of course, there are many copies of Villa Rotunda, a hugely influential building. On your left is a building in London called Chiswick House, which was designed by Lord Burlington in the early 18th century, and is a copy of Palladio's Villa Rotunda. And on your right is probably a building that's familiar to members of the audience in this room, which is George Washington's house at Monticello in Virginia, which is also a copy of Palladio's Villa Rotunda. And these are 4 copies of the Villa Rotunda, each all downloaded from the internet. So you can pick this up anywhere these days. It's, you don't even need to go there. You can have your very own. And I guess with the coming of 3D printing technology, everybody can have their own Villa Rotunda. I think probably the one at the bottom right is the deluxe version, and the one is the sort of basic starter version. But we were thinking about this. We were in Venice at the Biennale. We wanted to do something Venetian. The theme of the Biennale, which was curated by David Chipperfield, or now Sir David Chipperfield, as he's great. It's great in England. You see, when you become Sir, you finally get to build buildings in England, in Germany. Before. The theme was common ground, so we were interested in the kind of common language of architecture, so the copying theme seemed to fit into that. So what we did, we took on this idea of a quarter of the Villa Rotunda being the module, and if you repeat it 4 times, it creates the whole. So this is partly, I have to admit, driven by a budget. We could only afford a quarter of it. And we decided to make a copy of it through making a giant mould. And we would exhibit both the product of the mould, i.e. the copy, and the mould itself in the deliriously ecologically sound material of polyurethane foam. And so this is the basic concept. And what's interesting about it is what it does and how this process actually creates hugely interesting different takes on it. So on your left is a picture showing the inside of the mould, where you get the Villa Rotunda in negative. And then the next one along is the Villa Rotunda, or a quarter of it, in positive. Because we're spraying this polyurethane foam to the inside of the mould on the left, you get this rather strange Villa Rotunda shaped cave as the third image, and then you get this sort of box at the end, which is the outside of the mould. That was kind of meant to be a bit like Aldo Rossi's famous Teatro del Mundo. But as you will see, it was slightly different. So then this was organised so that the mould and its product, its I suppose its child, the thing that was born out of it. The womb and the child were exhibited diagonally opposite each other to create this rather sort of strange section that you see on your left, and slightly strange plan you see on your right. But the effect was rather marvellous because we placed it on axis within the arsenale, and as you walk down, you get this very strange play of symmetry of the positive against the negative. And, you know, two things that are essentially the same that begin to have a different kind of dynamism to them. And of course, symmetry, which is very unfashionable in architecture at the moment, is a brilliant form of copying where you only have to have an idea for half of it. In the same way, on the other half, works brilliantly. And their clients like it because it's kind of, they get, you know, 2 for 1, basically. Very popular. We've noticed that we've been listening, we've got this kind of, we don't know how to work the car radio in the car room. So we get these amazing adverts where everything is explained to you. It's fantastic, you know. We learn that cigarettes can give you cancer and things like that. But I like this idea, you know, the 2 for 1 thing seems to work. It seems to be big in California. So as you get closer to it, again, you start to realise perhaps that there's something kind of quite odd going on, because on the left-hand side, the impression is very, very different, and yeah, even more so as you get closer still. And when you start to see it from the side, it starts to have a very kind of different quality, and it's rather I have to say, it was rather a delightful, mysterious, and enigmatic object, and becomes stranger and stranger as you walk around it, with the bits that are missing. And then when you get round to the back, it looks like that. Not quite. Oh no, Rossi's. Tears I concede, but you know, not bad. Not a bad go. But it starts to become this sort of strange iceberg-like quality. So, just by the process of taking this object's intrinsic qualities and remaking it and making a story about an object involved, we start to get something that actually becomes, I think, ironically, a rather original object. Now, the Pence Biennale piece, which was done last summer, is really the culmination of the interest in copying that we have been pursuing for a number of years, and I'm going to try and illustrate that in a number of projects. This is a school in Holland, which we've done a lot of work in Holland. We hope to do some more work in the UK. When they make us sirs, we will get to do more buildings in Britain. And this is the town it's in. And yeah, it does look a little bit like Disneyland, but this is the real stuff. With its 15th century church and its funny little castle and its little market square. It's kind of Main Street USA, done Dutch style in the 17th century. And here we get, this is an existing building we were working with. It's a very boring looking school, and it's an art school, and they wanted it to look a little bit more exciting than this, and they needed to reorganise it. And this is where it is in this small town. You can see it's the biggest building in the town, and the building on the left is the church that you saw in the earlier picture, and the building on the right bottom corner is the castle that you also saw in the picture, that looks a little bit like it's a copy of the Disneyland castle, but actually isn't. It's the other way around. And the school is in the middle, so it plays a big part in the economy of this town, which is important because when the local government wanted to reject our designs, the director of the school threatened to remove the school from the town and take it somewhere else, because they didn't like what we were planning to do. And what they wanted to do was to make this more part of the town. So the yellow bits are bits that in our plan become sort of public spaces. And this is a sort of diagram of how we try to reorganise it. I won't go into too much detail about that because it's too difficult to explain. This became the plan. But the important thing to note is the patterned bits on the plans are bits of school that we made into public squares that link the school into the town. And the idea was to make a kind of internal street and internal public spaces for the students of the school, and external streets and external public spaces which would be for events, a little bit like this one, where they perhaps would hold lectures and members of the public would come and visit. And what our idea was, Louis Kahn once talked about building buildings around ruins. Our idea was to build some ruins around some existing buildings. And this is one of my favourite architectural drawings. It's by a man called James Gandhi, who was an assistant to the English early 19th century architect, rather, called Sir John Soane. And Gandhi was a romantic figure, eventually committed suicide, like all great romantic figures. And this is his presentation drawing for a pretty plum job, the Bank of England. And of course, as you do, you decide to show your bank, your client in the financial market, you exhibit the building as a ruin. Could you imagine Norman Foster doing this? He's doing some big building in Wall Street or something, and he's exhibiting it as a ruin. They don't do it anymore. We just don't have enough fun anymore with these things. And of course, it's all sort of mysterious and kind of strange, godlike light sources, and kind of deathly and sublime and terrible and all the rest of it. And then this is an English artist called Patrick Caulfield, an English pop artist, operating mostly in the 60s, 70s, and 80s. And this is his version of ruins, and I love this. This is a sort of idea. I think it was Ed Ruscha who actually said that pop art is social realism with the emotion taken out. And I think this encapsulates this idea, all of the sort of emotive quality of the previous images removed, and somehow that makes it more poignant, the fact that emotional content is absent. So this deadpan mode of expression is something we've been kind of long interested in, as we have in copying. And many years ago, Sam, my partner, whose name is on the poster for this lecture, so despite me doing all the work, he's getting all the glory. He bought this book of anonymous architectural drawings in a second-hand bookshop. And as you can see, there's a lot of post-it notes on the top there. This became a serious piece of source material, mainly because it was the only book we could afford at the time. As you can see, it was £14.99, very reasonable. What we had to see, we were taking things out of this book and mixing them up, and this is how we were sort of developing these ruins, and getting over the fact that we had no ideas of our own whatsoever. So we were putting these things together, and we were sort of making these models of them. We thought, and it was great. This school, we thought this kind of Gothic language was very appropriate because most of the students at this Dutch art school looked a little like Marilyn Manson. In fact, it was a little bit disturbed when he went in the workshop and you saw like Marilyn Manson on a bandsaw. He looked slightly uncomfortable. So they gave me this book. The teachers there, they gave me this book, and it was the work of a monk architect called Dom van der Laan. I don't know if anybody's. He does this sort of. There's a fashion in England at the moment for this really miserabilist style of architecture, which people like Surges and Bates do, and stuff where everything's grey. They make sure they get all their photographs shot when it's raining. It's sort of like Joy Division of architecture. And they gave me this book, and they clearly wanted me to be doing it like Dom van der Laan building, and I was pointing out, well, it already is a bit like a Dom van der Laan building, and they just hired me to change it. So, I don't know what it. But I did find this rather marvellous floor tile pattern in that book, which we then stuck all over the building so it looked like a commercial building. And the Don van der Laan iconography is religious, of course. And that connected quite nicely. It's called St. Lucas, which means Saint Luke. And it originated as a painting school in a monastery. But the ethos of the school is very commercial. It's a commercial art school. It's for kids learning product design, graphic design, and they all spend, I think, 2 years of their course working in industry. So, you know, that brought these two things together. And then we started investigating these strange kind of Gothic ruins that formed the front to this public space that was going to connect the building back into the town. Other bits of the building relate more to some of the suburban context. It's quite a big size, and this is a different part of it. And this shows a little bit of the treatments on the outside and a kind of a drawing we made showing how this square might be. Then, you know, we went to this marvellous place in Belgium where they make fabulous concrete things. We developed a modular system for making ruins out of concrete. And here you see a man just checking this bit of Gothic ruin. And here you see on the right is a crane that is transporting the piece of Gothic ruin from one side of the yard to the other. One of my favourite places in the world is this concrete factory. And this is them bringing bits of Gothic ruin and assembling them to create this place. And so basically this is a kind of like landscape project, I guess, really, because we did do stuff on the interior, but it's about forming these spaces and making basically a building that grew over a long period of time into something that was coherent and related to the city. And this gives an example of how fabulous the work of this particular concrete company is. It's just beautifully made. This is Vectorworks Extrude. It's very easy to do. You draw it, and you do Command E. And it comes out like that. It's a factory, and then it comes like that. It looks like craftsmanship. So yeah, and then there's the sort of more modern bits where it relates more to the suburban. And you can see that on the other side. But you sort of ruin that a little bit as well. There's sort of bits of it that are deliberately falling down, and they formed walls. And the pattern was used for the Don van der Laan pattern was used to make these rather lovely gates. It's nice working in Holland because they make things really beautifully there. It's not like England. Everything looks like a piece of shit. And yeah, some of this stuff I won't go on and on about it because it was informing me inside. I particularly like that one where there was budget for certain bits. So I like the polystyrene suspended ceiling ends. nice clash between this. So yeah, there was lots of sort of interior stuff we did as well, including building this extension which was built. It's a real sort of LA type project. It's a very simple steel frame and it's decorated and some nice chandeliers in there. And that's what they do at Christmas. And that's what they do at Christmas at night. Which of course we never expected, and we're delighted by because we never thought of them as Christmas trees. And this is just to remind you that we're not as mad as it appears, because that's across the road, you know. And nobody says that's all daft and silly. And, you know, apparently there's a place down the road from here where they did a place that looks exactly like this. They charge you about like $80 a day to go in it. You stay there. So the copying thing extends to we were asked to design some furniture. This is called Soft Hercules.
Actually, tell me your new building is called Hercules.
Yeah. The name was a compromise. I thought it was going to be the sit on your face chair. And the earlier version, it was twisted slightly in the other direction. We thought it was probably more polite to have the nose. Yeah, they sell for about $4,000 if anybody wants one. This is a project we're working on at the moment. One of the great delights of our practice is we get to work with interesting people, such as this fellow. This is called Grayson Perry. Some of you may have heard of. He's probably the most famous artist operating for it at the moment. He's become something of a kind of celebrity. He has his own TV show. I don't know why they thought it would be interesting to hear his TV show. Nothing about a picture that says there's anything interesting about him whatsoever. But he's mostly renowned for dressing up as a little girl called Claire, who's his alter ego. And he's a very serious artist. He won the Turner Prize, and this is an example of his work. He does pottery, and actually describes himself as a potter. And we've been commissioned. This is like an architect's dream job. We have been commissioned to work with this artist by a philosopher. It's like the project you get, when you start design a house for a philosopher in collaboration with an artist. We've actually got this as a real commission. But Alain de Botton, who is the philosopher in question, is a man who's often architecture to MPRVD. Did I get that right? Yeah, you know who I mean. One or two of us. And we're building this thing. The concept is a chapel. It's a sort of like a pilgrimage chapel, but it will actually be like a vacation home that you can go and stay in. And it's based on an idea around like these little wayside chapels. This is one in France, and this is actually one in the area of England where we're building this, which is Essex, which is an area just sort of north of London on the coast. And this is a very, very old Saxon church. And this is an example of the kind of thing, again, in Eastern Europe, a wooden church by a lake. And this is our site. It's kind of in a little village. So we've had lots of fun with the locals when they saw what we were proposing. But it's a site, it's a rural site, but it looks out to this landscape. This is a view across the sea to the port of Harwich, which is a major kind of container port and ferry port that takes you to continental Europe. And it's also on the route of an existing pilgrimage path which transverses the whole of the site. And our concept for it is again a sort of copying idea. It's a thing that repeats itself. It gets smaller and smaller and smaller. And it's covered in, it's like a little kind of medieval church, and it's covered in tiles which are designed by Grayson. And it's kind of interesting because he does these handmade pots that have a certain kind of authentic quality, and we're trying to reproduce that at a bigger scale. There's another sort of sketch view of it, and that's actually one of Grayson's drawings, interpretations of it. And it's called Our Lady of Essex, and it's based on a character he's made up called Julie. And most of the women in Essex are called Julie. And Essex, it's a kind of, he's from Essex, and it's a redemption story really, because he's telling this story of Julie. She has a normal life as well. She's not always in this slightly strange. I think she's just given birth in these particular times. But Essex girls are a little bit like, I guess you would call sort of like trailer trash type people. That's the reputation they've got in England, and it's slightly unfair. Because the ones from Kent are much worse. My beautiful lady, who's she's from Kent, and she's got an exception. Now, the Essex girls have a sort of slightly naughty reputation. So he's trying to redeem them. And this is a plan. It's a series of these spaces, and they get smaller and smaller. And when you go upstairs, I don't know how clearly I've got a pointer here. There we go. So basically, I'll go back one. Yeah, this is on the path, on the pilgrimage path, and you, members of the public, can come in at this end, and this will be a gallery where Grayson will be showing lots of work. This will be a dining room if you're hiring it as a holiday home, and there's a toilet here and a little bit you can sit outside. And you go upstairs, and you arrive upstairs, and there are 2 bedrooms here which overlook the gallery. So it's a little bit like a kind of church. There's a picture of it. That particularly upset the locals. We managed to bring them round. That's it in the daytime, in case you didn't notice. And Grayson, basically the sort of design of the basic form is out, and Grayson's designing all of the kind of decorations. So it's a little bit like working in the Renaissance, you know. And this is how it will look, and it will be built this year. This is how it will look. This is the ones we were showing the locals to see how you can't really see it. And this is Grace's design for the inside, which you can see. It's just going to be a relief after you've seen the outside and it's kind of a bit over the top. You've got to go into this nice calm space, which will tell you further things about the life. So it's a kind of it's a little bit like a kind of shrine, but it's based actually on quite a sort of rigorous geometrical principle. Another aspect of copying, which I'm kind of sort of conceptually interested in increasingly, is how it relates to notions of genetics. And of course, those of us who know a little bit about Darwinian theory and the work of people like Richard Dawkins, this idea of when things repeat and are copied and are replicated, and there are mistakes in the replication, that is the basis, of course, of evolution. And it's a beautiful metaphor for the way in which architecture develops. By copying badly other people's work, you actually inadvertently make innovations. And there's also something about the kind of biological quality of certain sort of geometric forms that's formed an interest in some of our stuff. Now, this isn't by us. This is the, I'm not sure if it's the second cock of the evening. It might well be, I might miss one too, but it's a, yeah, this is by Claude Nicolas Ledoux, one of my favourite architects, and it's his design, his rather subtle design for a brothel. It's part of a movement called Architecture Parlante, speaking architecture, which is something I'm very interested in. And this is a rather influential, different ways. And this is a project we were asked to do by the British Council for an exhibition in China, where we were asked to represent British culture in China. And we were asked to make a retreat for a celebrity couple. And I think the couple that they had in mind at the time are a couple who will be well known to you in this city by now, which would be David Beckham and Victoria Spice, who still remain sort of Britain's greatest celebrity couple, actually. They've almost become royalty. And we imagined that the only place they would ever get any privacy from the paparazzi would be the bathroom, so that we would design a bathroom, and we wanted to design a bathroom bathroom which expressed David and Victoria's love for each other. So we made this object which is made out of ordinary bath parts. So two oval baths or baths, if that make it easier to understand, are spliced together to form a heart shape in which Victoria and David could sit. Heart shape representing their love for each other, as do the entwined shower heads. But this is not purely symbolic, because of course if you really love each other you can do everything together. And, I remember once I gave a lecture a few years ago in Pittsburgh, and I had to fly into North Carolina, and I had to swap at the airport. And as I was going to show this project, and as I was walking around the airport in North Carolina, it did occur to me that I could really market this project. Some of the people I saw in the but what I love about this is that what's nice about this is these are absolutely standard products spliced together, and they create this sort of amazing, almost Baroque geometry when you put them together in this way. But also start to have a rather disturbing, fleshy, visceral quality. I think that one was particularly disturbing. And so this is something, this sort of bodily geometry, hard geometry against bodily stuff is something that's, and so we thought that was an appropriate language to use in a community library. And this is a library, this is a competition we won for a very small town in the middle of England. It's called Walsall, which is a suburb of Birmingham, and Bentley is a suburb of Walsall. I just gathered that you will understand that. But it has this little kind of civic centre, and it has this terrible artwork that they were all very concerned about called the Cairn, which we would have liked to have demolished, but they loved it all so much we thought, well, to win the competition we need to frame it with the building. And there's a church, so this was about creating a little kind of acropolis, and there was a nursery, a library and a study centre to be built on the site. This is a little diagram about how all the different bits work in relation to each other. And it's a very suburban site. And British suburbia is not like American suburbia. It's like really horrible. You don't get the kind of picket fences and beautifully manicured verges that you see in this city. But the idea, I think another reason we won the competition, the architects in Britain are very scared of suburbia, and we did the radical move of setting the building back from the street and putting some grass. That's what happens in suburbia. All the other architects in the competition had to bring it to the street edge to make an urban statement. But this is the plan, and again you see this sort of biological thing starting to happen, which is actually to do with how people circulate around the building. But basically, you come up a ramp or a step here, or from the car park here. This is a kind of community meeting room. You come into this bit here, you go into the library here, or into the nursery school, which is here. And they were very concerned about being able to keep an eye on who came in and who came out, particularly because of the nursery school. But there's a kind of language that developed out of this project that was to do with the relationship of quite hard geometries and this biological, bodily-like thing, which I think is, even though the architecture is harder on the outside, is still present. And so something that's coming out in our work more is actually the use of really quite hard-edged Platonic geometries as a section through it, and some of the elevations, and it has this very nice brickwork pattern which was meant to represent books on library shelves arch, which is a concrete frame which is infilled with bricks of different colours, so you get a gradation of colour as you go up. It makes a change from the kind of stucco and render stuff that's used. That's it from the outside. So unfortunately this project is on hold thanks to a global recession, which means that the council don't have any money. But we're hoping to resurrect it at some point, because I think it would be a very beautiful building. This is the inside of one of the main circulation spaces. It has a tower on a corner with a little amphitheatre for readings, and people can sit inside the bookshelves, the big chandelier hanging from the top. And that's sort of overall composite thing. And then this is also being, this is our sort of a kind of Venice beach house, but in the English town of Folkestone, a seaside town that's trying to regenerate itself, which is using again a similar kind of geometric language, which transforms itself into sort of biological forms. But they're sort of quite vague, you can't really tell what they are. But yeah, this is a beach house with bedrooms that overlook a space. There's a nice little bath there that projects over the living room, gives you a view out to the sea. We're hoping to build a number of these. These are the balconies, and right, this is by the sea, as the sun comes up, because it's the only sunshine you ever see in the English seaside. And it's got some interesting things going on in section in terms of using this geometry. And you know, I think there's something kind of, dare I say, quite which is deep in our psyche, quite LA about some of this stuff. You know, it's kind of wanting to be Frank Gehry's Norton House, which was one of the first things I ever came to see in Los Angeles. And then there are a whole series of different, there's a big 3-story one, there's a semi-detached one, and there's a 2-story one. And we're hoping at some point, there's a very rich man from Folkestone who's commissioning these, who's one of these people who's just become phenomenally rich, and he wants to put something back into his town. But he's very nervous about doing it, because he thinks that the locals will get upset if he allows us to build something like this. Which I think we're trying to persuade him that won't be the case. And this is a nice little view. The lady sitting in the bath, which projects over the living room, looking out towards the sea. Okay, so figural sections. This relates to another kind of, I think, a sort of kind of Southern Californian thing, which is our interest in facade-like features, things that are considered to be non-proper architecture. Facadism was something that the modernists were very much against, and was a criticism of postmodernism. And figural section is a rather pretentious name for a facade that Charles Jenks came up with in relation to our work. But figural sections, I've called them unromantic ruins. They're kind of fragments of things that, again, a little like the St. Lucas School, are devoid of emotional content. And this was our first full-on building. It was the Blue House, even though pink in the picture, which is a house in London, which basically is a house with an office in it. And so it has a cut-out house in front, and it has a little office block. And this is kind of Disneyland 3/5 scale. This street here is a very small street, and the street that goes here is a big street, and so on this side has a really big scale with huge windows and this fancy stuff. And this was completed in 2002, and deliberately uses kind of historical kind of cutout features. It was meant to be the absolute opposite of what everybody else was feeling in London when they were building a house at that particular moment in time, and which they're still doing today, which is to build a really boring modernist box. We didn't want to do that. This is the site. It's a very typical London site, very different from what you experience here. This is a main kind of highway here. This is an industrial street. This is a tiny street. These are all typical London late Georgian terraces. This is an old school building, and these are old industrial workshops that have subsequently been converted into rather chic apartments, which happened after we built this house and single-handedly gentrified the whole area. But you can see it's a very, very tight site, and that's kind of what you often have to deal with in London. So this is what it looks like built. So here's the house. It has a chimney there and an inverted one there and a cloud here, which was meant to be a tree. A tree there, and there's an inverted tree there that makes it look like someone's taken a bite out of it. And the windows are shifted over, so you couldn't do that in real life. And one's bigger than the other. And the whole idea is to accentuate the notion that somebody's gone round that with a chainsaw and just cut out the shape to really accentuate it. And then, of course, it's amazing. This is one room. And people think that's 3 floors. How did he get so many stories? Well, they possibly do, because from this view it has a very ambiguous quality, you see, because the scale of this thing, you can't actually tell where the floors are. And I like that. It's kind of has a, obviously everybody would recognise that as a house, and that's another thing I really like about it. People say, well, we get it, even though you're not an architect, that they get it. I like the fact that it looks like a very 3-dimensional object from this side, but when you look at it from this side, it really accentuates its flatness. So it's playing a game with sort of representation and trying to accentuate, making the window bigger here accentuates the sort of flatness and the fakeness of that. And then when people got upset about it, as they inevitably do, when you do stuff that's apparently fake, I could say, well, look, it's terribly clever. This sort of stuff, it's got all this sort of amazing beauty, and it's actually, it's really about Derrida. And they go, oh, well, it's all right then, isn't it? But I always say to them, well, this house is, I think we get an interior. Go to interior. It's South Park on the outside and Adolf Loos on the inside. And it has a rather, it is actually a very sophisticated plan. You come in through here into a garden. The shape of the garden mirrors the kitchen space, forming a sort of inside-outside room. The staircase that runs in front of the big window of the front facade creates a sort of element of theatricality, which is related because I guess the stage set quality of the house. Because people coming up and down the stairs here is something you see from the street, but because of the height of the stairs, you get privacy. You can't see directly into the main part of the house, but you get light in. This staircase takes you up to the office space, which is above here, and to a small apartment, which is at the back here. So the main entrance into the house is here. The other game this is playing is it's a sort of, has an ambiguous relationship between, is this a free-flowing space, or is it a series of rooms? And we kind of quite like that. I'm always interested, architects talk about space. Everybody else talks about rooms, corridors, we talk about space. As far as I know, only architects and Captain Kirk talk all the time about space. And so I'm kind of interested in, yes, great space. I'm very interested in the idea of what space is. And I think you kind of get that. We try to accentuate that by, for example, this is a kind of like a big doorway, but there's a gap here, and this is partly driven by the way it was constructed. It had to be constructed out of masonry because we couldn't afford a steel frame. And the masonry construction meant we had to have some weight, some loading going down this point here. But we didn't need it here, so we could cut that hole out. And then we accentuate this idea, you know, is this a piece of wall? Because it looks like it should continue as a piece of wall, that skirting board there should carry on with, or is it a column? Is it part of a language of modernist space, or is it a part of a more traditional language of room? And there was a lot of games played with that. You can see the staircase winds up behind the fireplace here, which is again a very sort of American thing. This house was very influenced by the early houses of Robert Venturi, which I admire very much. Venturi was a great hero for us, mostly because everybody hates him in America. And certainly after you built the National Gallery in London, they also hate him there as well. Which means we like it. But you know, I've always liked the way this column became the bit where people left little post-it notes because the phone was here and stuff. So yeah, this is the kitchen space. This takes you up to the front window. So as you come down these stairs here, this is the sort of theatrical moment. And you get a little bit of sense of that, the stairs going on here. This is a little window seat. There's various kind of cutouts and light wells. It's actually quite a complex section. And this is the house with the front taken off it. So you've come up the stairs here. And inside the house, it's almost as if there's a house inside that sort of modernist Corbusian thing. But this staircase wraps around as it goes up. And there's some games played with doors and stuff, which I'll say a little bit more about. Yeah, so here you are going up these stairs with a window seat. And this front with the fake house is actually a huge stairwell, which is double height in space. It's actually enormously kind of complex, and here you can see how the staircase wraps itself around here. There's a light well here, which is this space, which was designed to be sort of architecturally interesting, but kids used to love going on this, and they used to throw things at adults for their kind of dinner. The other staircase comes up here, and this is an office, and this is the thing that's like the building inside the building. The staircase wraps around. And inside the building is this rather interesting room, which is a child's bedroom with a view over the staircase, a view over the light well, and a view out to a very kind of complex, layered space with this little kind of bed behind it. So it's about nooks and crannies. This house was very much designed with a young child in mind. And as you come up here, there's a bathroom. The staircase leads you round into a bedroom that can be split into two. Again, this into an apartment. The built bedroom can be split into two, so there are two doors into it. By some coincidence, every house I've ever designed, the main bedroom has two doors into it, like you know in a French farce where somebody's having an affair, the husband comes back, so the lover has to go out one door, and the husband comes. All our houses you can do that. So if you were a person of a certain disposition who requires a house, where are your people? Here we played games with scale, so that we make great big architraves around here. We make doors that are too big for the opening with small architraves. So that there's a sort of strange kind of pictorial depth created out of this utter superficiality. And when you look out of the bedroom here, you get the array of windows. You get this rather marvellous sort of fragmented view of the city. And here is the architectural moment of the light filtering poetically through space. And I did live in this house for a number of years. to say that light shining through the bedroom windows there was a total pain in the arse, so I had to put some curtains up in the end. And this is another very sort of LA project. It's actually a TV studio. It's in Wales for the BBC, and it's in the old docklands of Wales, which is this bit of Cardiff, sorry, which is the capital of Wales. As you can see, it's a very nice place. And because it's a very nice place, they were trying to regenerate it, and they were going to build this big development here. And of course, the bottom fell through the property market a few years ago, and they were very fortunate. You know, the BBC were looking for a new site to make TV programs, and they decided that they were going to put it here. And we were commissioned by the developer to do the BBC building. This is the context. It's all these kind of old dock buildings, quite interesting actually. And it used to be the main outlet for the coal that was produced in South Wales would be exported around the world. So there were lots of strange buildings like this. Oh, well, these boats actually, strange boats like this that were for coal. And the programme that was going to be made in these studios, I think this is shown over here, Doctor Who, a very old stalwart of British television, the Doctor Time Lord who fights people like this, the Daleks and the Cybermen. And so we wanted to make a building that looked like Doctor Who was made. And this is it. And the tricky thing about this is because Doctor Who is the BBC's biggest money spinning thing, they have to be very secretive about the scripts. So there were no windows allowed on here because they didn't want members of the public. So we had to make a 300-metre facade with no windows in and try to make it some kind of urban statement, which, even though it's just really a facade with a bunch of sheds behind that, isn't easy. And so this is how we did it. This is the main entrance. There are various references to other programs. There's a medical program called Casualty. There's a fabulous Welsh language soap opera, which was people of the hills. So it's great. They would have these very glamorous, like you know, like on a soap opera here or Britain, there's all kind of glamorous people, and they're at an amazing glamorous event like the opening of the car sales showroom or something, drinking champagne, but they're all speaking in Welsh, which is a wonderful language. But again, you know, there's some like nice. This is a real. It's called the Norwegian Church, which is on the top road. Here's our building here. It's mainly boring sheds. It's this facade. It's the main entrance. No doubt Doctor Who's made in there. Oh, that was meant to happen. I've crashed. Sorry about that. I'll try and get it going again. How am I doing for time? Okay. Don't worry, we are about a quarter of the way through. Yeah. Okay. So I don't want to do that, I want to do this. Sorry, this has confused me for some reason. I just hate how. Look, see, we're quite close to the bottom. The thing on the side is near the bottom. Let's try that. There we go. So, just a couple of things about this. You know, it has some little stuff going on along here, which creates some interest at eye level, and some things that go along here that create some interest at kind of urban level. You know, and a lot of this stuff is partly to do with its relationship to, you know, the kind of industrial relationship with the site, and there's a lot of this kind of thing in the architecture of the city, and here's our medical sign. And so it has a lot of, it's sort of an abstraction of a lot of references. So, you know, again, this manages to look like a little house that's part of publicum, but also like a strange alien that Doctor Who might want to fight one day. So it's, you know, it's meant to have a sense of fun about it. And the chairman of the BBC, Lord Hatton, once a prominent politician, described this as a cross between the Doge's Palace and IKEA. Which I took to be a compliment. So again, another thing, the copying, and this is the last section. The copying thing, this idea, the collage world, which was alluded to in the Richard Hamilton image that I showed earlier on. And this is a project that goes back a few years now. It's 1997, it was quite an early project for us, which is the design for an advertising agency in Amsterdam called Kessels Kramer, who are the world's greatest advertising agency. And we were asked to pitch for this job, and they wanted an office that would say something about who they were. So we didn't draw any plans or anything. We sent them this picture, which is 2 Russian bear hunters. And this object here is a bear skin store. And we said to them, this is our vision of what your company is. And they loved it. They loved it. And which was strange, because as you can see from this picture, they're quite normal people. This is Mr. Kramer. No, sorry, that's Mr. Kessels, and that's Mr. Kramer. And they're Dutch, which means I was first introduced to Eric, who's remained a good friend of mine for many years. And Eric is 6'5". So you meet him and you go, hi. And then, or at least if you meet him. And then you meet Johan and you go, hi. But these were like perfect clients for us. And we were sort of came up with these. They bought a church. They bought this church, and these were sort of early collages we made. And this is a sort of possibly a unique moment in architecture. This is designed by fax. This was our first project out of the UK. We used to fax drawings like this over, and they'd come back with ticks and crosses and as things they wanted. So they needed a platform, some kind of mezzanine. And one idea was like a pier, aircraft carrier, cowboy fort, giant diving board, and these were various elements that we needed in the office. And eventually, they went for the cowboy fort, what we called the Baywatch Tower in LA, in a church, in a Gothic church in Amsterdam. Patches of astroturf with picnic tables, a strange library object. These are sort of workstations, hot desking stations. And they absolutely love this. And I was looking through an English newspaper on a website today with the world's coolest offices. This wasn't in it. But something that looked very much like this was in it. And I thought, that's great. We did this in 1997, and they still think it's cool. So this is what it looks like. There's a little picnic bench here, and this strange truncated shed. Here's the lifeguard tower, so you've got a little ring on there. And it's got a really weird scale. You can get a little sense of it when you see the bookshelves and somebody's about so high. And they step out of this and they look really small. It's really. You probably know who he is. They always reserve this spot, the most sacred place in the church, for watching soccer. Yes. Television screen here. And they had, there was an American guy actually, who was from LA, who was working there, called Tyler. He was slightly crazy, and so we did the diving board for him. It was off the end of the floor here. He was our favourite. When we phoned the office, we phoned up and we'd be talking to somebody and you'd hear in the background, "Is that the guys from FAT?" And he'd go, yeah, it's the guys from FAT. He goes, "Great, I love those guys!" You see there's some little gnomes here on the roof of the library. And this has become a sort of international language of like, trendy sort of office design, I guess. And so this is another project which is a proper building and a collage project. It's part of what was proposed to be a major development in the docklands of a town called Middlesbrough. In the north of England, which is a little like kind of Cleveland, Ohio. It's a sort of, just a sort of Rust Belt kind of post-industrial town. And they were going to develop. Of course, very little of this has happened because of the economic situation. And I still work a lot with the developer for this. He's a great guy, and he's incredibly environmental. These are all of the things that we had to deal with. And integrate into the design. And this was master planned by a guy called Will Alsop, who's an architect you may have heard of, a British architect. He had this great idea of having these buildings called sugar cubes, which are incredibly difficult to plan. 30 metre by 30 metre by 30 metre cubes. You try knocking a resi plan out of that with a decent net to gross ratio. Thank you, Will. And we're going to be and this was going to be a huge sort of kind of sustainable development. This was our concept. An apartment building on top of a chalet for our sugar cube building. And that's the proper drawing of it. It's the apartment building and there's the chalet. Chalet was going to have a bar in it because it's a building that's called Community in a Cube. That's not the name I gave it. And it was meant to have everything that a city might have. People in Middlesbrough. This is the first apartment building ever built in Middlesbrough. So people in Middlesbrough live in houses. So we thought we should have some houses on the roof of the apartment building. And there they are. They're in a kind of new urbanist style to go with the Swiss chalet and a kind of modernist block. It's a very green building, so it has a south-facing courtyard with lots of green stuff, and there's a kind of cascading garden here, a kind of hanging garden that goes down here. And also, the building was meant to promote health and happiness. And certainly, the first of those would be very welcome in Middlesbrough. That's one of the places where they eat a lot of fried food and drink a lot of beer. And you can just go in here and up in the lift, or you can walk up the garden. And that kind of manifests itself in this section where there's several levels of this courtyard space that you can walk up. It forms a south-facing garden for the block as a whole. Or you can go straight in there and up in the elevator. And it has a hole in the front so that the south light can shine through onto the north square. And you can see these things that became known as the sky homes. And so there's a kind of obligatory CGI thing, full of real people who do this kind of thing. You walk around Middlesbrough, you'll see people do this all the time. When you get to the top, there's this kind of deck, and all of the rainwater off the roof is recycled into these planter boxes to create this kind of planting effect on the facade of the courtyard. This is a sort of idea of what it is meant to be like. It has commercial units, including the pub on the ground floor, a huge CHP plant that's meant to find 5 buildings like this, so it's this massive district heating system. These are small apartments on the first level of the courtyard, which are studio apartments in yellow. This is a typical floor, so you would come up in the lift here, you're on this kind of green bridge, and you go into the apartments, which are all dual aspect. They all have views from 2 directions, which gives great cross ventilation, and also the dockland context is very spectacular. This is an idea of the level of kind of detail and what this is doing to the architecture. You know, there's this is the levels of insulation in here to give you walls which are like 500 millimeters deep, so we get this kind of medieval levels of thickness in walls again. I always share that because you can do the technical stuff as well. It's not just the funny stuff, you know. You do the serious stuff. And there it is built. And sadly, it's rather lonely because it was the only one that ever got built. Which makes it even more incongruous. So this is going to be one day a bar. There's a little street on the top. And some of these apartments have been sold, but not all of it. It's a very, very depressed market there. But you know, here's an example of where you've got this rather fabulous countryside beyond, which you can see from the flats. It has this square. There's something rather kind of like a Curaçao painting about this place at the moment. It is totally devoid of any kind of activity. It's really, really quite weird. It's a shame. This is around the other side. They have put some glazing in here, so it actually looks nice. And this is it with the delightful new college building. This is an old industrial transporter bridge. The environment's actually rather spectacular, and it's become, not surprisingly, something of a local landmark. This is a view into the south-facing courtyard. As you can see, it gets a lot of sun up in Middlesbrough, on the coast. But it does catch the howling North Sea wind very, very well. Now, it is actually quite nice. As we get the sun the day we photograph it. You get the sense of the stepped garden that goes up here, and this is part of the arrangement that gets you into this, what will eventually be a green bridge full of planting that will grow down this facade. And again, you've got this sort of notion of biological things and sort of platonic geometric shapes. This is a view inside. It's the courtyard space. It's kind of cross from one side to the other with the little QT houses on the top. I think the local drug dealer has just brought this one. That's it. Thank you very much. I'm very happy to take questions, but I'm also very happy if you all have had enough and you want to go and get drunk. I will leave it up to you. I think they all want to go and get drunk. Monday.
You know that there was a dean here. maybe come up as a reference.
No.
But it strikes me, well, one, your comment about the reversal on wrapping ruins, building, and that influence of that has been pronounced. I don't know, and I guess the question is when, and for you, a reference doesn't seem, I guess the question is about reference. Because that, yes, that too, and that too, and of course, yes, that too. I wonder, it's really kind of question about threshold and how you know it's enough referentiality for it to sustain what you believe it to be, when you believe it to be enough. It's a kind of Mozart question, you know, how they ask him this, like.
That's an interesting reference.
You know?
The short answer is I don't know. Some critics would say we do know when enough is enough. And I guess our bank manager probably says we don't know when enough is enough. Because, I mean, it's interesting because, I mean, on a serious commercial, this work is very controversial. It probably looks really normal in LA. But in England, it's very, very controversial. And just last week, I lost a very prestigious project because the representative client, depending on how you look at it, felt it was inappropriate, or perhaps she was an idiot. Did not feel that would not accept it, and we lost the project. A prestigious project, and that's happened on several occasions. We have been fortunate enough to win a lot of competitions, but we've come second in a lot more. So it's difficult to know. I mean, I guess there's also, I don't know, it's purely intuitive. Sometimes it gets rained, sometimes it doesn't. But it's hard to know, I can't really answer. Sorry, that's a really pathetically rubbish answer.
I have a question. You alluded to sort of liking things that other people dislike, perhaps even liking things because other people dislike. I heard that Robert Ventura and Scott Reynolds had a game they played where they sort of pick the ugliest thing they could think of and justify liking. I'm wondering if you could sort of do the same thing to your mind was the most horrendously awful building or sort of cultural object you can think of is justified liking.
Well, it's a very interesting point that you make because I think that that technique of Robert Ventura and Denise Scott Brown of picking something you don't like and justifying liking it is a very interesting technique, and one that is, I think, a really major kind of critical contribution that they made, because by forcing yourself to find reasons to like what you don't like is an amazingly critical way of thinking, because you are kind of you're kind of psychoanalyzing yourself, and you're often, and what they did, and I'm very happy to hold my hands up and say a lot of our thinking, particularly in our earlier work, was very influenced by books like The Owner from Las Vegas and Complexity and Contradiction in Architecture, which I consider to be very important books. But it's a way of thinking critically, trying to like what you don't like. And one of a word I didn't mention in this part is the kinds of projects that showed were not the ones that are so much about that. But the issue of taste is a big part of where we're coming from. And I'm interested in taste from an English perspective because, and I'm sure it's the same in the United States, because taste is a way in which social status is exhibited, and hence it is highly political in architecture. But architects never talk about it. They have ideas that, you know, this is good work, this is bad work. So a certain kind of architecture is good, it's proper architecture, and a certain kind of thing is bad, it's not proper architecture. A lot of it is to do with taste. And you know, I actually come from a very kind of what you would call blue-collar background, like my family, and this literally happened to me. I was brought up in a suburban house on the outskirts of Liverpool. And it wasn't a spectacular childhood, but perfectly content. I went to architecture school, and within a year I was berating my mother about how appalling her furniture was. And it's just really interesting the way you're, in architecture school, you're indoctrinated to think like that, and you actually never think that might be quite offensive to go and tell you, which is all disgusting. And it was only many years later I kind of realised that, and I think there was a moment, to answer your question more directly, there was a moment many years ago when I was thinking of moving house. I went to look at some houses, and I went into a house in the East End of London, and the way that the house was decorated, and the carpets, it made my skin crawl. It was like there was something kind of deeply disturbing about how appalling the taste of this person was. I came out and I thought, that was really interesting, that had that effect on me. There's something interesting in stuff. And I think that's the moment where I decided I would try to like that stuff and to use it. And of course it works every time. I mean, you know, some of those projects, they go up on like a building design magazine's website, and the below the line comments are unbelievable. You know, what the rage is brings out in the architects in England, you know, where they're streams of, like, you know, quite nasty stuff comes out. I mean, sometimes witty. You get the occasional great one. You know, I think it was the soft Hercules chair. Somebody just wrote this comment saying, "God, I'm so sick of their shit." You know, which I thought was really, really quite. I thought that's quite good. I'm so sick of that shit. But you know, you get people who get really upset by this. I mean, it's like, what's the matter with you? And it's kind of revealing, I think, of a strange, kind of psychotic thing that happens with people when they become architects. I think that's important, because one of the problems architects have, of course, is their ability to relate to other people who are architects, who are their clients and their users and the people who have to live with their decisions and so on. So yeah, it's a whole very interesting subject. I'm only doing classes.
Mine's kind of a chicken and egg question. So you present these ridiculous buildings with your style of drawing and your attitude towards the projects and your outlook. And I suppose my question is, are the drawings and your way of presenting a way of selling these which would be seen as absurd buildings, or does the absurdity of buildings come out of genuinely your way of drawing and your way of storing your ideas architecture?
I think there's a lot of interest we have in the relationship as a process between architectural representation and the product. And I think it's a very interesting area. I think some architects don't really do it, others do. So, you know, like an architect like James Sterling, for example, his method of drawing and his architecture were very, very closely related. And so I think there are certain techniques that come out of the drawing style that result in the building, but sometimes it's kind of, it's slightly more conceptual than that, you know. Sam was asked once in a sort of funny question now thing, he said, you know, describe your design technique. And he wrote it as Apple C, Apple V. That's our design technique. So, but there are, you know, there is actually, aside from all of that, I mean, I would hope that the projects also walk a fine line between a certain level of absurdity and a certain level of sophistication as well, which stops them dropping into, well, this is just silly. And I find that very interesting because, of course, some critics, we actually get a very good press from most of the British main architectural critics, funnily enough, who can see that there's a certain erudition in what we do, even if they're sometimes uncomfortable with it. So I think, yeah, we're trying to draw a fine line between these things, and the drawing is part of the technique of doing that. The use of copying and pasting techniques. I mean, that's about the only thing I know to do on a computer, so I have to do that. I can't do it. So I was trying to, one of my year-out students was trying to teach me Rhino, but quickly gave up. So yeah, I think the drawings and the techniques are important as part of the generators of the approach. And I think some of the buildings actually have that sort of look of built drawings.
Considering you could frame all of the work in the sort of comforting intellectual terms, so conventional in academia, what are you saying implicitly by presenting it the way you do? Is there a commentary that's consciously implicit in the way you present the work?
You mean in terms of its relationship to an academic language?
Yeah, you can make it safe for the room, so to speak. You know.
Well, I guess, you know, one always tries to make it safe for the room because you don't want to get lynched on the way out. And, I think we try. I mean, it's a strange. I think these things are very, very strange events where I come along here and I'm standing on this peculiar platform, and you're all here when you should be kind of having a beer or something, and talking amongst yourselves, listening to me. And I guess I find a lot of architectural lectures really boring. People speak in a very dry way about it. So I'm often trying to. I think I owe you some entertainment as much as anything. I think I've managed to do that a little today. But I'm also trying to say something quite serious. I'm also talking about implicitly the way we talk about architecture. Architects speak in a very peculiar language, I think. Get a bunch of them in a room together. I guess they're like any other group. If you got a bunch of lawyers or a bunch of doctors in a room together, they would be speaking in the same way. But yeah, there's a sort of very strange, this language of space that architects talk about, and I'm trying to implicitly criticise that, I guess, or to try and think about, be critical about the use of that kind of language. Why do we talk about space? What does that mean? What is space? You know, is space the stuff that's just left over when you built the walls? Is it the stuff that's contained? Well, we know, of course, that space is much more than that, because a space with a riot going on in it is a very different space to a space with a sex act going on in it. And they actually might be happening at the same time, which would make a very different kind of space again. And if we were to, if I was up here with a DJ deck spinning some discs, this would be a very different space to the one it is now. So, and I think architects have been very uncritical about the way they use that sort of language. And I suppose one of the things we're trying to do is be critical about architecture and critical about the way we talk about architecture.
Great, thank you.
Thank you.